Congratulations, it's time to unbox your brand new Samsung flagship. You've put up with that old, slow, broken screen piece of trash for long enough, and now it's time to switch to a faster and more powerful Galaxy that'll make you more successful and attractive. But wait a minute, you think, turning towards the strategically placed flag of your country of residence. You just happen to live in a territory where that new Samsung phone uses an Exynos processor, promising only a desolate future of subpar battery life, lower benchmark scores, and diminished romantic prospects. Okay, that may be just a slight exaggeration, but if you read some posts on forums and certain corners of social media, it's hard to understate the antipathy towards Samsung's Exynos processors. Some phone enthusiasts really hate these chips, and more to the point, the idea that they're paying the same as other Samsung customers, but because of where they live, their shiny new phone runs a lemon of a CPU. So let's start from the top here as we dive into the controversy around Samsung Exynos, whether it really is worse, and what it means that, more than likely, Exynos will be returning for parts of Europe and Asia with the Galaxy S24 series. Until very recently, Samsung had a dual sourcing strategy in place for chips in its flagship phones. So what does that mean? Well, in some countries, most notably the US and China, Galaxy flagships got Qualcomm's leading Snapdragon chips. Elsewhere, they ran Exynos, a similar SoC developed by Samsung LSI, its chip-making division. There are various reasons why Samsung has shipped the same phone with different chips in different regions. Originally, it started with Qualcomm having various essential patents nailed down, which would have made it difficult or impossible for Samsung to ship Exynos, or more accurately, Exynos modems in certain parts of the world. Bottom line is it's more of a legal thing than a technological issue. Dual sourcing certainly has its advantages. The Samsung mothership obviously makes more money if it's putting its own chips in at least some of its own phones, versus letting Qualcomm take a cut of every sale. And it gives Samsung's mobile division a safety net if either Qualcomm or Samsung LSI has an off year. Case in point, the good old Snapdragon 810 in 2015. When that chip tested poorly, Samsung just switched to Exynos across the entire Galaxy S6 and Note 5 series globally and licensed Qualcomm's modem separately. Other Android manufacturers were just stuck with the Snapdragon 810. The likes of HTC, LG, and Sony had to suck it up and release phones that ran hotter than the surface of the sun and were often slower than the previous generation of phones that they were replacing. And more recently, of course, Samsung went all in on Qualcomm for the Galaxy S23. But most years, it's been a roulette wheel of Exynos or Snapdragon depending on which country you were buying in. And folks have been comparing the two different flavors of Samsung flagship for almost as long as the company's been making Android phones. Veteran tech publication AnandTech has compared several generations of Galaxy models in both their Qualcomm and Exynos varieties. And if you read them, you'll see a clear pattern. It's very obviously a one-sided contest. Exynos generally runs slower and hotter, with heavy hit on battery life as a result. Big YouTubers like Jerry Rig Everything have also shown in detail how, for instance, the Snapdragon version of the Note 20 scored higher in benchmarks than the Exynos model, while also running cooler and using less battery power. And in 2022, XDA's Adam Conway dove deep into the two versions of the Galaxy S22 Ultra, Exynos 2200 and Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, finding Exynos at a sizable disadvantage compared to the Qualcomm version, in terms of both background power consumption and power usage under load in a CPU throttling test. And what's more, on early firmware, the Exynos model was noticeably laggier in certain tasks, pointing to poorer optimization for the Samsung chip. Now, it's natural to see some variation from chip to chip when each is being developed and manufactured separately and then slapped into the same phone doing the same tasks. You wouldn't expect to see identical performance across both variants, but this isn't just a few points or a few frames here or there in artificial benchmarks. Time and again in recent years, Snapdragon has come out on top, with Exynos being left in the dust. And the differences were in key performance areas like battery life, which anyone who's ever experienced battery anxiety can relate to. All of which has contributed to Exynos having kind of a lousy reputation among tech-savvy phone buyers. If you're an enthusiast in, say, Europe, which has gotten Exynos pretty much every year, it's hard to not feel like you're being shortchanged compared to your pals across the Atlantic. You're paying just as much, sometimes more, than Galaxy owners in North America, but whether it's an S10 or a Note 20 or an S22 Ultra, look at the cold hard numbers, and it's hard to argue you're getting anything other than an inferior product. Samsung has always maintained that its phones in different regions deliver an equivalent experience regardless of which chip they run, but of course equivalent doesn't always guarantee absolute parity. There is some inherent wiggle room implied there. Besides which, there has been a little behind-the-scenes consternation over the years when it comes to Exynos that's not reflected in that cleanly confident PR statement. And a lot of the blame for that Exynos-related drama in the late 2010s can be pinned on this guy, the Mongoose. Let me explain. Early Exynos chips used off-the-shelf ARM Cortex core designs, but in 2016 Samsung started building out its own range of custom high-performance cores for Exynos chips, codenamed Mongoose. Why Mongoose? Well, Qualcomm's core designs at that time were named after snakes, and you know, in the Animal Kingdom version of rock, paper, scissors, Mongoose beats snake. Mongoose cores provided roughly Qualcomm equivalent performance in the S7 and S8 series, but really started to struggle in the S9 and S10, to the point where the difference versus Snapdragon was noticeable. As a result, late 2019 saw the Mongoose's ultimate demise, with the Texas-based team responsible for developing those custom cores being laid off just as Exynos 990, the final Mongoose-based chip, was going into production. That chip was met with a resounding nope from Samsung Mobile Korea, which opted to switch to Snapdragon for its local versions of the S20 and Note 20. Obviously, Korea is the home market for Samsung, so that's a pretty big rebuff. At the time Samsung LSI, the chip division was reported to have felt humiliated by the decision and tried to have it reversed, but to no avail. Samsung then attempted a mini reboot of Exynos for 2021, even issuing a slightly contrite promotional video in the run-up to the Exynos 2100 announcement in January of that year. And I want to say, for a company that usually comes across as quite forthright and proud, it was a rare acknowledgement from Samsung that things hadn't been going great with Exynos. We all knew that, but it was a pretty shocking thing to see, this admission of past mistakes, alongside a new marketing message that told us supposedly Exynos was back. It was back, but with off-the-shelf ARM Cortex designs once again, basically going back to the way things were before the whole Mongoose episode. As a result, Samsung would end up producing chips whose designs were more similar to Qualcomm's rather than trying to chase Apple's single-core performance at the cost of efficiency. But in the S21 and S22, even though the Exynos and Snapdragon designs were more alike than ever, Qualcomm still pulled ahead, as evidenced by our own testing in 2022. Exynos was back, but it was still slower and hotter. That led to the genesis of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 for Galaxy as a slightly overclocked chip for the Galaxy S23 series. Wherever you buy an S23 around the world, it runs Qualcomm. So with that, you might think that Exynos is dead and buried, at least for smartphones. But all signs now point to that not being the case. Benchmarks of Galaxy S24 test devices running a future Exynos chip have emerged online in recent weeks, and Chinese leaker / feline bezel enthusiast Ice Universe also claims knowledge of Exynos' return in 2024. And that fits with Samsung's public line on the subject, which in mid-2022 dismissed rumors that it was discontinuing Exynos for good, telling the Korean press that it was simply reorganizing its SoC business with a plan to strengthen its competitiveness in the mid to long term. Further reporting from Korea claimed that a dream team of more than 1,000 employees from both Samsung LSI and Samsung Mobile was working on future custom chips for future high-end Galaxies. As such, during this reorg, Samsung would skip Exynos for 1 or 2 years to allow the new team to get up to speed. Now it seems that's more like 1 year and not 2, with Exynos' likely return in 2024. Once again, you could take this move as another tacit admission that things weren't going great over at Team Exynos, even after the switch from Mongoose to off-the-shelf ARM core designs, even when the Exynos design was very similar to Qualcomm's and even built on the same Samsung manufacturing process. Exynos was struggling to meet parity with Snapdragon. The best case scenario then for folks in Europe, Africa and parts of Asia is that they unbox their Galaxy S24 and find a chip that's roughly in the same performance ballpark as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 used by their friends in the US and China. Something that's not noticeably worse in basic benchmark tests. Those are humble ambitions to have, but hey, we've got to start somewhere. Will that actually happen? There are some promising early signs, for example around the progress of Samsung's 3nm manufacturing process. But ultimately it remains to be seen how things will pan out, and whether Samsung's dream team will be able to keep pace with Qualcomm in 2025 and beyond is also very much an open question. Because all the online hate directed at Exynos chips, as much as it is often exaggerated, isn't completely without merit. And Samsung knows this, or it wouldn't be in the process of reorganizing the team responsible for building them. Even so, it's worth remembering that those of us who even know what an Exynos is represent a tiny fraction of Samsung's overall customer base. Most people have no idea that some Samsung phones perform slightly worse if you buy them in certain countries. And however things go with that latest Exynos reorg, that's unlikely to change. But what do you think? Will 2024 be the year Samsung finally comes back with an Exynos chip that can match Qualcomm's performance? Or will Snapdragon retain the performance crown once again? Stick around and subscribe for more coverage and that inevitable S24 Exynos versus Snapdragon comparison when the time comes. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.